This is really ultimately what led to the financial crisis of 0809. It was not Wall Street greed. It was not, speculative excess. It was not the house prices are in a bubble, all the things we hear, deregulation. There's a range of things that people claimed caused the financial crisis of 0809, but it was really caused. I teach students at Duke, and increasingly they were just little babies when this happened. But a couple of years back, when they were a little older, I would ask them, what do you think caused the financial crisis of 08 and 09? I mean, guess what they would say? Most people would say, greed on Wall Street, mortgage-backed securities, fraud, Bernie Madoff, all that would come out, financialization. The standard view is that was a failure of capitalism. So once again, the response, well, I'll talk about it in a moment, but let me give you briefly, and that there's a lot on this in the book, because there's not only sections on crisis, there's a section on money and banking that deals with this. You have, starting with really Clinton in the late 90s, but then really accelerated under George W. Bush, a deliberate national policy of increasing the home ownership rate. Now just think of that, the home ownership rate. It was about 65% in 2000, 2002, before this program really ramped up, meaning 65% of households in America owned a home and lived in it. Now, what does that mean? That the rest of the country was homeless? No, the rest rented apartments or rented houses or in condos and things like that, right? So now what would contribute to a home ownership rate of any rate? People making decisions on whether to buy or rent, but they do that all the time with cars. Shall I buy a car or lease a car? Or should I buy ski equipment or should I rent ski equipment? So the whole issue of buying and renting in order to get, in this case, what amounts to housing, it should really be left to the market. It really shouldn't be something where the government says, we have some ideal home ownership rate, which we must target or we must increase. And that was their view. Their view was we need to increase the home ownership rate. And we need to therefore apply public policies, maybe even alter public policies to increase the home ownership rate. Okay, so that was really the goal, as a national goal. For those free marketers out there, when you hear national goal, you should think of central planning. You should think of why would government think it knows best what the home ownership rate is? Right, because that's one thing. But the other thing they did was they said, notice the home ownership rate is different depending on race. All right, so if the overall home ownership rate in the US was 65%, they would look and they would notice, well, that's only the average. If you look at the home ownership rates of whites, it was something like 74%. And for what was the next biggest group? Asians, and then Latinos, and then Blacks. So they would say, well, Black home ownership rate is something like 45% or so. So you get the idea that the 65% is an average that masks a wide variation. And the argument was there's something wrong. Not only is the home ownership rate not high enough, but the gap between home ownership rates and between whites and Black is a problem. And so it wasn't just a policy to artificially boost the home ownership rate. It was to artificially boost the home ownership rate for those who were really lower in terms of home ownership rates, Blacks and Latinos. Okay. From a banker's perspective, you could argue that they have their own, everyone has their own motivation, as I said before, as to whether to own or rent. But in the particular case of low ownership rates for Blacks and Latinos, the theory in government was that it was due to racism, that it was not due to bankers judging the credit worthiness of borrowers. The argument was Blacks don't own homes to the rate of others because they're being discriminated against. They're perfectly creditworthy, it was argued, and yet racist bankers were preventing them from owning homes. All right, long story short, to remedy this alleged problem, the government agencies that help finance mortgages, which in my view shouldn't even exist, but if you remember, they were called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and in some cases the FHA, which is the Federal Housing Administration. They changed their policies deliberately to make it easier for mortgages to be issued to people who couldn't afford homes. That is the bottom line of what happened. And if you know anything about home finance, the basic idea is you borrow. Yes, you do borrow the bulk of the purchase price of a home, but to show that you have a self-interest in owning the home and that you actually own it, you put in a down payment. You make a down payment. Sometimes it's 20%. Sometimes it's a little less than that. The specific government policy was to lower that down payment as low as possible, to make it as affordable as possible. They would change the rules and they would say, well, now government will guarantee loans, even for people who put very little down, in some cases, zero down, no money put down, whatever, meaning the entire purchase price of the house was borrowed. Well, if you know anything about incentives and self-interest, the less money you have involved in the purchase of a thing, obviously the less you care about it, the less you own it. And in this case, the idea was, well, let me borrow all this money. I'll get a home. If I can't afford it and I default on the loan, it'll just go back to the bank, and the bank is taking the house as collateral. And it's really no loss to you because you didn't put any money into the purchase of the home. This is really ultimately what led to the financial crisis of 08-09. It was not Wall Street greed. It was not, speculative excess. It was not the house prices are in a bubble, all the things we hear, deregulation. There's a range of things that people claimed caused the financial crisis of 08-09, but it was really caused by this artificial government, this policy of government artificially trying to boost the home ownership rate of people who basically couldn't afford homes. And if you can't afford homes, you're eventually going to default. And if securities are created that create like baskets of these loans, well, those securities themselves will go bad. They'll default as well. So a cascade of mortgage defaults basically occurred with a lag, and all the securities associated with those payments also. So financial institutions obviously got in trouble because they were holding these things. We know what happened in the aftermath. Oh, by the way, guess what happened to the home ownership rate after the financial crisis? It declined significantly. So there was like an artificial boost from 65% to maybe, I don't know, 67%. But at the end of the financial crisis, there were so many defaults and so many people leaving homes that the home ownership rate was lower at the end of the process than at the beginning. So talk about defeating your purpose. The purpose itself was wrong, but that was the result. What else was the result? Huge bank bailouts, huge. The TARP, it was called TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. It was 800 billion at the time. This sounds like small change now when we're hearing about trillions, but at the time, 2008-09, an 800 or 900 billion dollar check from the Treasury to the banks was huge. It was a huge thing. And it was done almost overnight. There was almost no discussion of it in Congress. They were just panicking. They were just scrambling. And people like Barack Obama, who hadn't yet won the presidency, remember, he didn't win office until November 08. The TARP was passed about a month prior to that, and Obama voted for it. So the same, and a lot of the Democrats did. So it was a bipartisan approval of this process. There was not anyone really saying, listen, this is government's fault. We should maybe get rid of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That wasn't true. They are still there today, those two agencies. And so the conclusion was not that government failed yet again, and we need to pare back government's involvement in the financial and mortgage sector at all. It was just pinned on capitalism. You remember later, he does this all the time, Obama would try to get votes by being populist and referring to bankers as fat cats, these fat cats on Wall Street, these cronies, these crony capitalists, right? Well, Obama funded them with bailouts as much as anyone else. So he's created these fat cats, created these cronies.